Within the ethnographic research program, an anthropologist has to compile information from lots of different sources. Of course, we're getting information from the people that we work with through participant observation, through interviews, through other types of data collection methods, but we're also constantly going to be going back to that background research portion of the program. Of course, we do a ton of background research before we even go into the field, but we also try to keep up to date with research that's being done around the world in order to best be able to interpret the cultural practices that we're seeing. So in that vein, there are a lot of ways that anthropologists get information. And one of the most obvious is by looking at the anthropological literature. Anthropological literature are the ethnographies and other reports that anthropologists write about the work that they've done. So we have databases of ethnographies going back 100 years or more that are available to anthropologists to do this background research. One of the reasons that we use this background research is because we understand that as a profession, we have certain standards that need to be maintained as we're doing our research and as we're writing up the results of that research. And so anthropological research in general is often published in anthropology journals, academic journals that are focused on disseminating information produced by anthropologists. And these academic journals have some pretty good publication standards, which is also very important for the production and distribution of science and social science research. One of the things that makes anthropological journals and other science journals so reputable is what we call the peer review process. Peer review is a program in which an anthropologist writes a piece of work, and then that work is sent out to other anthropologists for review. This is extremely important in anthropology research because it ensures a few things. One, it makes sure that any anthropology research that is published has been conducted in an ethical setting. So the anthropologists are not betraying trust, they are not being biased in their research or using ethnocentrism to drive their research. They don't have some sort of ulterior motives. So we use the peer review process to make sure that anthropologists do their research in a way that is appropriate for the particular questions they're asking. And the peer review process also ensures that the results or the interpretation of the data that anthropologists come to makes sense in the context in which that data is collected. So it's basically experts reviewing experts. Anthropologists write their work, and then it's reviewed by other anthropologists who understand what the basic situation is like. I kind of think of it like going to a doctor. If you went to a heart doctor and they said, oh, you got a little thing with your heart, you know, probably got to do something about that, and you wanted to get a second opinion. Second opinions are great. But if you had a heart condition and you wanted a second opinion, you'd go to another heart doctor, right? You'd go to a cardiologist. You wouldn't go to a dentist or a podiatrist or a plumber. You're going to go to someone who knows exactly what it is that they're looking at because of education, because of experience, and that's exactly what the review process is. It's when people who have a certain wealth of knowledge because of their background review the work that has been done by others. And this maintains consistency throughout the discipline in both the logic that's being used to interpret culture and also in the research methods that are being used to that end. So anthropological literature in these anthropological journals is a really great starting place for doing background research and then also continuing to learn as we move through this process of ethnographic research. But of course, this is not the only type of information that anthropologists can use. There are lots of other sources of data that we might turn to in our pursuit to understand human cultural systems. So we can look at things like newspapers, books, internet, television. To do this, though, we have to be able to accurately judge the sources that we're looking at. And so essentially we're asking, can I trust this piece of information? Because not every piece of information in the world has been peer reviewed. So there are a few questions that we can ask of any type of information as we're doing research. And this applies not only to anthropology, but anything else that you could possibly think about. Anytime you want to look at a newspaper article, anytime you look at the internet, anytime you're writing a research paper for another class, you can ask these questions to better understand the trustworthiness of the source that you're looking at. So the first question you want to ask, who? Who is the author of this research? Is this person an expert somehow in the field that they are talking about? Or is this, if we're looking at, say, the internet, people often go by anonymous names or, pseudonyms on the internet. But if someone is producing science or social science research that is meant to be taken as a legitimate source, they should have no problem signing their name to it. So when data is put out in the world, or when, whether it's news articles or blogs or whatever, if someone's not willing to sign their name to their research, then that instantly is sort of a red flag. It says this person might not have sort of the credibility that is required if we're going to take this information at face value. Second of all, we ask how. How has this person or this group come to the conclusions that they have? What are their research methods? If they're talking about people's opinions about the MTA, how many, what was their sampling system like? How many interviews did they conduct? Did they talk to 2 people or did they talk to 2,000? What are the various sources that they use to support their findings? What type of background research have they done? We can ask why. What is the purpose of this particular report or an article or a television show? What is the author trying to convince me of? And then finally, we can ask when, or we can ask about the timeliness. If we're talking, for example, about climate change, which is a big issue in the world today, certainly with the elections coming up, climate change is something that a lot of people are talking about. If we want to understand the best science on climate change, then we should be looking at sources from within the last few years. We probably shouldn't turn to scientific articles from 1942 because we know a lot more about climate change. We have better science to understand how the Earth is changing and how humans sort of fit into that process of change. So we need to ask when this piece of information was published as well. Let's go through a couple different types of sources that anthropologists and other people might turn to when doing research. So the internet. The internet is a fantastic place. We all use it every day. We probably use this more than anything else when we're gathering information about the world. You have a question about something, Google it, right? There's tons of information at our fingertips. The internet, however, is in general not peer-reviewed, which means that basically anyone can write anything. And that's a really powerful aspect of the internet. There's a sort of openness to the internet that makes it so that everyone's voice can be heard. That's fantastic, but some voices are a bit more legitimate than others, especially if we're talking about people producing reliable, reputable information. So, to compare a few internet sites, here is the homepage of the American Anthropological Association. This is the webpage for a professional association of anthropologists. Everyone who is a part of this group identifies as an anthropologist. Most of them, if not all of them, have received some sort of specialized anthropology training and work actively as anthropologists. Anything we find on this website has been produced by someone with a specialized anthropology background. And this is a very good site for also sort of, self-policing or self-peer reviewing. People who are involved with the American Anthropological Association are very interested in maintaining high standards for the work that they produce. So if we read something on a site like this, we can be fairly certain that it reflects unbiased, non-ethnocentric understandings of human cultural systems. Compare that to, say, Facebook. Facebook gives us a lot of information about the world. It tells us a lot about the people in our lives and the people that used to be in our lives. It's probably not the best place to get scientific information, though, because anyone can write anything they want on Facebook. If I open up my Facebook homepage and read what a friend of mine has written, that doesn't necessarily make it true, just because someone has said it on the internet. And so this is something to remember whenever we look at internet sources, that anyone can write anything. And so running through that checklist of, who is it who's doing the writing? Why are they writing it? What are their sources? What is the timeliness? Those are very, very important questions to be asking when it comes to this sort of unregulated portion of the internet. There's still a lot of great stuff to be found here, but we have to be very careful to approach it with a cautious eye. We can also look at print media, magazines. There are hundreds and thousands of magazines that we might encounter on any given day in our world today. Some print media is better than others. Whether we're talking about magazines or we're talking about newspapers, there are specialized print media that do present very good, unbiased, reliable information. Things like National Geographic magazine, Scientific American, even Wall Street Journal. We have to remember, though, that print media is always written for a certain audience. And so there may be biases or goals that sort of underlie the guiding position of all of these various sources. So if we look at magazines like In Touch or National Enquirer, not to say they're not interesting, but these are print media sources that don't tend to give us the most reliable information, because this is not necessarily media that is written by groups of experts. It's definitely not peer-reviewed. These types of print media tend to be sensational, right? They're looking for attention-grabbing headlines. So this is not the place that we want to turn if we want to get the most reliable information about something that's going on in our world today. Books. Books are also kind of a tricky one. I think a lot of us feel like books should be trusted, right? Books always give us some sort of ultimate reliable truth. But that's not necessarily the case. Books always reflect the viewpoints of the people who write them and the people who edit them and the people who publish them. So we can look at sort of the processes that books go through to get into production to understand a little bit why some books might be a little bit more reliable than others. So here are two books, An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore and Wind Turbine Syndrome by Nina Pierpont. These are both books that have been published on the subject of climate change. Al Gore's book looks at climate change by reviewing the science of thousands of scientists all over the world over many, many years to suggest very convincingly and in agreement with 98% of climate scientists today that humans are contributing to the changing climate of our Earth. This book over here suggests that wind turbines, which are a source of alternate energy, that wind turbines have negative health effects on people who live near them. And specifically that living next to a wind turbine can give a person migraines. This book is written from the perspective of alternative energy being a negative thing. Okay, so we have these two differing viewpoints. Pro-alternative energy because the energy we're currently using is killing our planet versus anti-alternative energy because it's giving people migraines. How do we understand what the differences are between these two books? Well, for one, we can look at how this book was produced, how both of these books were produced. Al Gore wrote this book based on many, many, many other people's research. So we can actually flip to the back of the book and we can look at all of the different scientific studies that Al Gore used to synthesize and produce this particular volume. We could turn to the back of this book and also look for all of those sources, but this isn't as reliant on a lot of those scientific studies because there aren't that many scientific studies to support it. So we look to the background research that each of these authors has done. One of these authors has done a significantly greater amount of background research than the others. An Inconvenient Truth was also published by a major publisher in the US and around the world. And it's not to say that having a major publisher is the only thing that makes your research worthwhile. But in order to be published, this book had to go through extensive editorial reviews. There was an editorial board that made sure that the work that was being presented here accurately reflected the data that it was based on. Come back over to the Wind Turbine Syndrome book. This book did go through an editorial board, so that's something. But if we were to do a little bit more poking around, we would realize that the editorial board for this book is comprised of this woman, the author, and her husband. So the editorial board in this case are two people who are probably very interested in seeing this book be produced. It's a matter of, monetary reward, which was not necessarily the case over here. So who is saying, yes, this book presents reliable scientific information, and who is saying, I have decided that I know best about this particular issue? So this book has essentially been peer-reviewed, and this one has not. This book was self-published, so it was published by the author and by her husband. Self-publishing is something that's becoming much more popular, and self-publishing is a great way for a person to get their ideas out there. I think self-publishing is a fantastic contribution to the book market in the United States and around the world. But with this increase in self-publishing, we have to be very careful to understand where these ideas are coming from and who exactly is vetting them. We can look at television as a source of information. A lot of us get our information about the world through TV. If we look specifically at news, we can see how some news outlets do a better job than others at presenting factual information. So on the left here we have BBC World News and Al Jazeera. Both of these are pretty good at presenting unbiased, real-life news that considers multiple sides of a story. And today, Al Jazeera is probably the best news outlet in the world for presenting this unbiased, unbiased information. Over on the right here, though, we have Fox News and The Daily Show. And we've all heard about Fox News and sort of the disastrous farce that this news part of their name is. Fox News does a really good job of presenting false information. They consistently skew the data that they present. They present it in such a way that it's sensational, it's very inflammatory, and that's because Fox News is aligned with the political right in the United States. It represents the ideological values of a certain group of people. Fox News, though, really does a disservice in skewing their data so much. So a study was done a while back that suggested that people who watch Fox News are actually less informed about what's going on in the world than people who watch no news at all. All right, so people who watch this particular news channel are less informed than people who watch no news. And that's because they are so skewed, so biased in the material that they present that it can't even be considered, even slightly, a reliable source of information. How about something like The Daily Show? Another study showed that a majority of people between the ages of something like 18 and 35 get most of their news from The Daily Show, and especially when Jon Stewart was hosting it. The Daily Show does provide a lot of, very interesting information. Jon Stewart did seemingly a very good job of presenting factual information, but we still need to remember that this show has a bias to it. It has a more left-of-center political bias, and it's on Comedy Central, right? This is a comedy show. It's meant to be humorous. It's meant to be satirical. This is not meant to be the #1 news outlet in the world. So we need to take that into consideration as well when we try to determine the reliability of these various television outlets. Here's some other television that's become increasingly popular over the last few years. There are many, many different, sort of documentaries or scientific explorations of various phenomena on the planet on TV today. And if you turn on Netflix, you can get dozens and dozens of things like this, produced by National Geographic TV or the History Channel or the Discovery Channel. And all of these names sound very impressive. And historically, National Geographic and the History Channel and Discovery Channel have all, been these great sources for more scientifically oriented television. However, over the last few years, there's been a shift in all three of these media conglomerates. And what we're seeing is that there's less of an interest in presenting accurate scientific information about the world and more interest in producing this sensational style of television. Because, let's face it, it's more fun to watch TV shows about ancient aliens than it is to watch, nature programs about how flowers bloom. this is more exciting. It's sexier than the life cycle of earthworms. And so these television channels have moved away from presenting reliable scientific information, and they've moved into, what's going to get them the most views, what's going to get the most clicks, because that's where the money is. So when we see things like this, even though it's produced by sources that should be more reliable, we really have to again question, who are the experts who are backing up these findings? What is the research program that they use to get their data? When is this information coming from? What is the purpose of this? Are we supposed to be convinced after watching Ancient Aliens that, in fact, these Nazca lines carved into the earth floor in Peru, were these actually made by aliens? What is the goal of this particular programming? Because just like anything else, television is created for a particular audience. And more, we're interested in those exciting, sensational things that are really not very attached to reality, unfortunately. All right, so again, we look for who, we look for how, we look for why, and we look for when. If we see any sort of red flags come up when we're looking at any type of source and we can't answer these questions, then we automatically have to say, all right, this may not be the best source for valid information.